I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Janine. Welcome to our webinar. I'm really pleased to be talking with you about blended learning. And I made a little note to myself on this particular agenda screen just because I think we've talked for a long time about blended learning as educators, and many of us are using blended learning in our classrooms. But the truth is, what we're doing is really not well blended. And so I hope through our conversation today, which will include defining blended learning, talking about the research on blended learning, talking about various models for blended learning, and then talking about best practices with some specific implementation ideas, will help you think about how your implementation of blended learning could result in a better blend. So thank you for joining me this afternoon. When I think about my experience with digital products, I have to admit, because you can't see me, that I have a lot of gray hair. I happen not to be a millennial. As we think about millennials, one of the things that we know about millennials is that they really are falling short in the skills that employers want of their employees. They are weak in terms of literacy. They are not skilled as practical mathematicians. And according to employers, they're not good at problem solving in technology-rich environments. It seems contrary to what we might think about digital natives. But we know that in the U.S., we have lots of millennials who rank below those millennials in other countries in terms of their literacy, in terms of their numeracy, and also in terms of their digital capabilities. And so that's, as educators, disconcerting and something we have to pay attention to. And so when we think about where we are as educators, we want our students able to use all the tools available to them to be successful. And we want them to be ready for college and ready for careers. And being fully capable with technology is a very important aspect of that. And their education really needs to map to it. So I want you to think for a minute about what blended learning means to you. And get a definition in your head. And then be really reassured that there isn't a universal definition for blended learning. When we look at various definitions, one thing that seems to be consistent across those definitions is that it includes some online and face-to-face instruction. And it is really clear that when we are talking about effective blended learning, it's not just that we add a few online strategies to traditional teaching methodologies. Successful blended learning really requires a planned approach with full integration in order to create a scenario where our students' needs are met, the goals of our schools are met, and the needs of our whole school population are addressed. So we're going to talk about that in just a few minutes. So here's one definition of blended learning, and there are certainly many more, but what we're really talking about is an approach that will combine effectiveness and socialization in terms of instructional opportunities with technology. And thinking about that, we're thinking about really active learning opportunities for students in the online environment. If you have been paying attention to the news, you know that there are many higher ed offerings that are provided online, but more and more we're seeing high school learning opportunities in the format of online courses. And virtual learning in some states, such as Florida, has become a huge part of the offering for students. We really have to think about what our students require and how we can most effectively meet individual needs, and think about whether those needs are best met in face-to-face instruction with students right in front of us, or whether students can be remote and the opportunities can be provided online. And we'll talk about what determines that mix in a few minutes when we talk about best practices. But when we think about it as educators, most of us really think about our classroom, that physical setting, as the hub of learning. And that doesn't change with blended learning. Our classroom still is the hub of learning, and the teacher is still at the center, and I want to be really clear about that. Certainly we talk about student learning and being student-centered, and we want that, but when we think about blended learning, the teacher plays a central role, and the teacher's classroom is critical. So that doesn't change. That positioning doesn't change when we move towards blended learning. But we need to be thinking about what opportunities are best delivered face-to-face and what opportunities can be effectively and perhaps more effectively delivered in a setting where students are remote and they're doing the work online. So we want to think about that, and in your head as we're talking through this, perhaps you can think about what you deliver course-wise, content-wise, and what of that content might be more effectively or equally effectively delivered in a different way. So when we think about design, because as I mentioned, blended learning should be really delivered intentionally, we want to think about our online learning experiences and our face-to-face learning experiences, and think about the integration of those in order to have a well-blended learning opportunity for students. And so this visual helps us think about the fact that some of the experiences may be remote and some may be face-to-face, but they come together to create the best possible learning opportunities for our students. They are not disparate silos in terms of instruction. So why would we want to use blended learning? Why were we motivated to do so in the first place, and why might we be motivated to refine our practice to truly blend what we do? Well, certainly one reason for doing it is that we can address the various learning needs and learning styles of students. Another is that, based on the research, we can increase student motivation. Students are more motivated to learn in an online setting. And certainly, as we move into an age of differentiated, individualized, personalized instruction, blended learning helps us deliver that much more successfully. When we think about our students, I know this is a duh kind of statement, but technology is really a daily part of their lives. And if we think about what we want to provide as our content and our delivery mechanisms, we want to map to what students do on a daily basis and will do in the future. And so it really does seem important to integrate technology into our school lives. We know that when students who are in middle and high school are asked what their ultimate school would be, they include online learning as a non-negotiable element of that. We also know that students really from third grade on are communicating with teachers electronically. They communicate with their friends and their families in that way. So we have very young children FaceTiming with grandparents, and we have older children texting on a regular basis, and all age children using email. So we know that we're in an increasing way using technology as the way that we communicate and dialogue with others. And despite what might be our considerations and our thoughts in terms of students' economic status or other barriers to entry in terms of blended learning. 70% of high school students in the United States have access to computers, and 67% have access to cell phones. So blended learning is a very real possibility for them. For us as teachers, we are able to really make better use of class time so that we can focus on higher order thinking activities by delivering basic information, review, prerequisite skill reinforcement, extensions through online learning. And it's also true that if we use blended learning appropriately, we will see a much better level of discourse in our classrooms than we have previously experienced. So what does this mean in terms of what we do in our classrooms? Well, I don't want to tell you that there's one menu, one recipe for successful implementation of blended learning. And that is because every school, every classroom, every teacher is different, and that is an essential element to determining how blended learning is implemented. There are some fundamental questions that teachers need to consider and schools need to consider in order to decide what is the most effective way to implement blended learning. And there are agreed upon models of blended learning. Michael Horn is one person who's identified those models. There are others who have similar models that may have a little different label, but basically are the same, and they're really viewed as a continuum. And I thought it might help us to talk about those models for a minute. Obviously, the first model is really when the teacher is doing all of the instruction face-to-face, and there are some supplemental online resources that are not central to what's taught instructionally, and the students benefit from that as extensions, additional practice, etc. There are flex models where the majority of the content is delivered online, and there are face-to-face tutoring opportunities that are also provided. There are models where students rotate, so they receive part of their instruction online, and in the same course they receive face-to-face instruction, and that may be within the day, or it may be across a week that happens. Then there are students who are able to take advantage of settings that include virtual learning and face-to-face learning, and the student determines how much face-to-face time they need and how much online time they take advantage of in an after classroom setting. So it basically means that the course is delivered primarily face-to-face, but the students can get additional online learning opportunities, extensions, reinforcement, etc., after hours or on their own. There are also opportunities for students in truly virtual settings to receive all of the content online. And if they need an opportunity for some face-to-face instruction or some interaction with other students and with the teachers, they can come to a center. So in places like Florida, where they have virtual academies, 90-some% of the instruction is delivered online, but students are assigned to a central center where there's always a staff person available, and there are always teachers available, and other students can come, and they have the opportunity for dialogue and small group work with other students and face-to-face instruction. And then there are opportunities for students in many schools to use a computer lab where there is a teacher, a technology teacher, or other teacher who does the primary instruction, and that teacher may not be located at the school. That teacher may be online. so the students are receiving the instruction in that way. And we see that a lot of times with AP classes and some IB coursework where the teacher is not physically there. There's a lab assistant or someone monitoring managing students and monitoring students, but the coursework is delivered from a remote teacher. So when we think about this blended learning continuum, many of those models are not models that most of us as classroom teachers would ever take advantage of. They're far beyond what we're interested in. What we're really looking for is an opportunity to, in our own classroom, use some online resources that blend with what we do face-to-face. And we are thinking about opportunities based on whatever devices we have available. So in some cases that's one-to-one. In other cases that's a small number of devices in a classroom that could be used as a center or station. In other cases it would be a lab, and in other cases it might be devices on a cart. So devices do have some inhibiting factors or expanding factors in terms of what we consider, but most of us are not thinking about virtual academies. That's not really what we're talking about today. So when we think about what we typically are talking about, we're really talking about a situation where we're going to have our students do some work online in order to pre-teach, reteach, extend, and we want to do that in a way that's most effective. And also we want to expand the opportunities for students within our given block of instructional time. So as teachers, when we're thinking about that, there are some questions that help us determine the approach we want to take. So the first thing we always think about when we're planning for our next year and the classes that we're teaching, we want to think about what our goal is in terms of student mastery or proficiency. So what is it we want students to know when our course has ended? And we also want to think about, of the standards or learning objectives that we have, which can better be achieved with face-to-face instruction and which might better be achieved with online instruction. And then we want to think about, as we're doing that, what types of learning activities we would use in the online portion of our work. So might it be games? Might it be additional practice? What possibilities do we have to really complement our instruction? And we want to think about how much of the time that this is done would be in class time and how much of it would be out of class time, and how do we make sure that we're not only integrating that effectively, but using the feedback from each component to shape what happens next instructionally so that we're best supporting our students. We have to think about the amount of time dedicated to each part, and we'll talk about this more when we talk about a concrete example. We want to think about how we integrate the grading. So what do we do in terms of assessing? Assessing is always an important part of what we do, and we want to assess what happens online. So do we add value, increase the point total for face-to-face opportunities to demonstrate what we know as students, or are we putting more emphasis on what's done online? And then what happens when students have difficulty with what's provided online? How do we manage that? How do we support that? If it happens after hours, how do we compensate for that? We have to think about all of those as we think about what we do. So we've talked about what blended learning is in a sort of broad way. We've talked about some considerations in terms of models. Many of those are not things we are really thinking about as classroom educators. We talked a little bit about some of the questions we should think about in terms of implementation. So in light of that, what are best practices? What has the research to date showed us about what creates the most effective blended learning opportunities for students? And I think this first one is the most important one for us to think about. When I think about the classrooms that I visited or my own classroom in terms of initial forays into blended learning, it was often about using the technology. We got smart boards, and so we were all about using smart boards, or we had videos, and we were all about using videos, rather than stepping back and thinking about what are the standards or learning outcomes that we have for this grade level for our students, and what technologies will help us achieve those learning outcomes, rather than focusing on our newest toy. So all the students have tablets, we've got to have things on those tablets. It really does cause us to pause and think about how do we best meet our learning objectives rather than focusing on the tools, recognizing that they are indeed tools and using them to further student achievement. So as we do that, we have to think about what learning problems exist for our school, and what technology do we have, what would we use to help our school overcome that problem. And that can be broadly in terms of the school. We can also think about our particular classroom or even a small group of students. And as we implement, it isn't something that is a single effort. I think one of the things that we have to really understand about blended learning is that we have the opportunity for continuous improvement. And so that typical approach that we have instructionally, that typical instructional cycle, remains in place. And the typical educator's process of planning and acting, observing and reflecting on our own practice is really critical as we continually refine what we do with blended learning. So we have to, first of all, think about what the goals are, and then think about how we use technology to meet those instructional goals. And one of the first questions we want to ask is, are we talking about our whole class, or are we talking about individual students or small groups of students? Because one of the primary purposes for blended learning would be to meet the needs of the varied learners in our classrooms. And we want to use technology to really meet whatever instructional goals we have. And that really has to be our focus in terms of truly blending the learning opportunities. And as I mentioned, one of the things that research is showing right now is that we have a lot of people using technology in classrooms. A lot of educators use technology, but not effectively and not in a well-blended way. So we want to think of our face-to-face time and our technology time and really integrate those so that we maximize student learning. And we want to think about where each component best fits and how we can reinforce and augment so that we have a holistic approach to instruction. So we have to plan for this. This is not something that's happenstance. We have to think prior to the start of the course and on a weekly basis and a daily basis about how to truly integrate this effectively. And then we have to think about the students in our classroom. And as we do so, think about those students who need to be active in their learning. All of them do, but in different ways. We need to think about students who are struggling. We need to think about students who need some challenge. And we need to think about how to take that into account as we develop the blended learning opportunities we provide. We also need to really take the opportunity to observe our students and even ask students. I think one of the things that I learned early on is that when I asked the students about what worked for them in the way I taught and what didn't work and what they'd like to see more or less of, I really improved my teaching. And that really is true with blended learning. What about what we did today worked for you? What didn't work for you? What would you like to see more of or less of? And so using that opportunity to, in an ongoing way, determine what your students prefer and where the greatest gains are will help you create the best learning opportunities for your students. I'll be perfectly frank. It's great to think about blended learning now, before the school year starts. That allows us to think holistically about the classes that we're teaching, the courses that we're teaching, and to really start from a new perspective with blended learning in mind. thinking about meeting individual student needs, maximizing student gains with the new perspective. Too often what happens is we get a new technology tool and we work to integrate it after the course is already started, and it doesn't really fit well with what we tried to do. So if we start now thinking about, here are the tools I have, here are the goals we have for our students, how do I use those tools to help students attain those goals and demonstrate proficiency, we have a great opportunity. So starting now from scratch is a really great idea. Another thing we have to think about is that we all have preferences in terms of technology. Some of us like videos, some of us like games, some of us like independent learning opportunities, some of us like smartboard and whiteboard kinds of opportunities for students and for our instruction. We tend to have our own biases. And what we really have to think about are, what are the full range of resources that are available for us and for our students, and use those to the maximum rather than getting stuck in a rut and using the same thing over and over again. Although many people think of blended learning as something that creates less of a community, what the research shows is that we can actually increase the interaction among our students and provide for a much more powerful learning opportunity that includes social learning and collaboration when we use online learning. This requires some work on teachers' parts, and sometimes it can require us to provide opportunities for chats with the right constraints so that we don't have issues around that. There are lots of ways that we can really power up the social and emotional connections that come through appropriately using technology, but we should certainly think about that. As we think about social media as a whole, obviously our students are in a world of wanting to continually connect, and they do so in so many ways, whether it's Instagram or it's text messaging or whatever it might be. We want to provide all of those opportunities for students, obviously with the right boundaries in place, but recognize the power of that. And we have to recognize that when we create these blended learning opportunities, we have to value each of the components. So sometimes some of us are not as comfortable with technology, and we undervalue those components. In order to have success, in order to create the right blend, we have to value each part's contribution, and so that's part of creating the right environment. You may have been using technology for a very long time and feel very confident about it, but it's always helpful to step back and to think about really starting in the most effective way, and as we do so, to really think about starting small. So not every class, not all aspects of what we do, to really be able to evaluate and modify before we expand it to everything we do. So starting incrementally, making sure that we think about every student in our class and making sure that they understand what's expected of them and how it works, really observing and seeing where the challenges are, seeing where students get motivated and where they get frustrated, and then continually refine that and expand it. The research shows that's best practice. And finally, even though you may assume that all of your students are digital natives and that they've had many years of experience with technology as a part of their classroom learning process, the research shows that it's really good at the start of the year to orient your students to all the tools that are going to be used, to explain why you're using these tools and the rationale for the approach that you're using, to make sure that students truly understand the expectations and truly understand how to best use and what to do when they're frustrated, when they reach barriers, when they have technology problems. That preparation makes a huge difference in terms of success, and it's also about preparing yourself, making sure you fully understand the tools you're using and that you have well-planned pathways for you and for your students. So why do we do this? For one thing, it provides an opportunity for consistency, and we'll talk about that. It certainly saves time for teachers. It allows us to meet individual student needs. It allows students to be in charge of their own learning, and the research shows the power for that. We know that we can contain costs if we appropriately use these resources, and we know that we can get the data we need to truly drive instruction. Overwhelmingly, the most powerful benefit for blended learning is that we increase instructional time, and we know that students' time on task, students' opportunity to learn is most critical. The more time students have for learning, the more successful they're going to be. So that's a very powerful motivator. So what do we mean in terms of consistency, in terms of what we do in our classroom? Well, one of the things that we know about our students is that they each bring a different set of strengths. And what often happens is that we are providing different learning opportunities for each small group, rather than exposing students to the same content and differentiating that particular content. With blended learning, we can provide an opportunity for students to read ahead of time, to annotate ahead of time, to listen to audio passages ahead of time, to come back to text and read again and annotate, or to practice additional times with math. We have the opportunity to provide the same content but slice and dice it differently when we use blended learning in a way that we cannot when we're using solely print and face-to-face. In terms of teacher time, we know that we should be on an ongoing basis collecting data about students' performance. We should be using formative assessment and interim assessment. They're very powerful, but it's very time-consuming for us to paper pencil analyze that data and use that data to drive what we do instructionally. When students take assessments online, when students do their practice online, we are able to save time in terms of grading, but more importantly, we're able to save time in terms of analysis. And what the research shows is that it's important to very quickly analyze the data and act on it. And if we're doing everything paper pencil, it's nearly impossible to do that in a timely manner. So having the opportunity to assess students online and to grade online and then analyze that data, even down to the item level as you're seeing here, so that you're really able to very specifically address student learning, is incredibly powerful. And when it's done from a digital basis, we save a lot of time. One of our challenges as educators is really providing instruction that meets individual student needs. We all know it's important, but the research shows that adaptive instruction absent technology is nearly impossible. As educators, we simply don't have the time we need to personalize instruction. And so for us to be able to provide tailored instruction focused on a specific target learning objective standard for one student or for a small group of students is incredibly powerful. And technology enables us to do that, enables us to provide very specialized instruction for students and very specialized content. And that opportunity for focused practice, focused assessment is going to make a difference in terms of student outcomes. The research is very clear about that. So being able to drill down to that standard level, being able to choose the right types of questions, and to really focus your instruction can make a huge difference. And we know that when students take charge of their own learning, when they know what the objectives are, when they know where they're headed, and they can practice as much as they need, they can time the learning opportunities so that they are ready and best prepared, makes a huge difference. And so when students have that power through digital opportunities like this, where they can read and reread. They can take an assignment when they're well prepared. They're able to use the digital resources that help them, things like underlining and highlighting, all the annotation tools. They become much stronger students. And so that student-driven aspect, where students know what's expected, know how to get there, know where the gaps are, and have the tools at their fingertips, really can make a difference. Unfortunately, with textbooks, so often that's overwhelming for students and results in lethargy, and we know that technology can support student-driven learning. It is important for us to be able to look at student performance in an ongoing way, so that item level analysis is important, but also in intervals, and to be able to look at that performance relative to the standards that we use in our classroom, and to determine students' level of proficiency. And again, that is so difficult to do without data at our fingertips. And digital assessment, and online reporting can be very helpful to us and allow us to analyze that data. It's also very helpful to administrators, who can begin to identify trends across grade levels, across the whole school, be able to understand what resources might need to be deployed, where professional development would be necessary. So having these resources so that we can very quickly make data-driven decisions will result in increased student achievement. The research is really clear about that. We also want to make sure that we are exposing students to next generation assessments so that we really understand their thinking, the processes that they use, so that we can expose students to higher level thinking, more cognitively demanding assessments. And these types of technology-based assessments, technology-enhanced assessments, really give us data we've not previously had before. It allows us to increase the rigor of what happens in our classrooms and prepare students for success in college and careers, and so that becomes very important for us and for our students. There are many times as classroom educators, we know that content is critical to cover. When I think about it as an elementary teacher, we know vocabulary instruction and grammar instruction really is important to include in our literacy block. But we find it challenging to find the time to fit it all in. And technology really can allow us to do that. Interactive tools allow students to move forward and for us to fit in that content that's so critical for success. And it also relieves us of things like grading, so that we can really focus more on differentiated instruction and face-to-face instruction. So the power of that is unbelievable for us and for our students. So we know that these kinds of tools can make a very big difference. At Sadlier, our platform, Sadlier Connect, allows teachers to think about what's best for their students and to think about when online assessment would be valuable, when eBooks would be beneficial, when games might be important, or additional practice. And all of those resources are there for teachers and students to use when appropriate, based on the instructional goals that are in place. And that's really what we as educators need, are those kinds of tools that we can deploy appropriately, not because we now have iPads or we now have Chromebooks or we have smart boards, but really rather because that's exactly what we need to help students attain their goals. So I'm hoping that you have some questions that would be something that would be illuminating for the whole group. Do we have some questions, Janine?
Yes, we do. Thank you. This is very informative. The first question is professional development important for effectively implementing blended learning?
I can't say enough about the importance of professional development according to the research. What the research shows is that teachers are often given a lot of tools and they're maybe shown the how to use the tool from a technology perspective, but not how to best use it instructionally. And so one of the things that professional development can do is to really help us think about all the resources we have and where they best fit instructionally, what their greatest power is instructionally, and really help us think about how to take those best practices and put them in place in our classroom with the specific goals we have at our grade level and for our students. So professional development can be very powerful in that way.
Great, thank you. Um, could the products you showed be used in a blended learning setting and why?
I think I started to talk about that a little bit, and yes, I mean, I think that when we think about our role as educators and we think about blended learning, we know that there are a range of resources that are out there. Content that is digital content needs to be high quality. It needs to meet our instructional needs. We know that online assessment, based on what the research shows, is very powerful. So we at Sadlier have a tool that allows you to monitor progress, to provide formative assessment, summative assessment, and interim assessment, so a comprehensive assessment approach. And teachers would be able to look at their setting and their students and see whether that would further their particular instructional goals. Certainly, having the right data to differentiate instruction can make a difference. As I mentioned about finding time for something like vocabulary instruction, having an interactive vocabulary program can allow teachers to incorporate vocabulary instruction in an effective way with enough time for vocabulary instruction so that students actually acquire new vocabulary. So, I think one of the things, Janine, you certainly can share with the participants are the tools that we have available, and we can certainly also share with them some of the value that those tools provide in terms of blended learning.
Absolutely. Um, so I will actually put my email address in the chat box, and if any of you would like additional information on blended learning or the digital programs that Ellen had mentioned, of Sadlier's digital programs that offer a blended learning, can be implemented in a blended learning model, please don't hesitate to email me at jferrara@sadlier.com, and I will put that in the chat box. But we do have another question, Ellen. What is the best way to implement blended learning with students with special needs, for example, ADD, ADHD?
Okay, that's an important thing to think about, and certainly the various learning needs of students have to be considered. There's not one approach that works best for each type of consideration. With ADD and ADHD, it's really important that there are frequent check-ins with those students. Those students have much more difficulty staying engaged, managing their own time. So those are some of the things we have to teach up front. How do we manage our own time? How do we monitor our own performance? But it also helps for teachers to check in with those students. That's one of the nice things about online tools is teachers have the capability of checking in to see are those students procrastinating. That's so typical of students with ADD and ADHD. Then a quick message to that student to say, I see that you still have these assignments that you haven't started. It would be a good idea to begin them now. So there are lots of things that we have to think about. There are students who certainly need smaller chunks for learning, and so being able to create content using a tool like a custom-built assessment or practice tool allows us to narrow the amount of content that students are exposed to so that they can be more successful. Having a tool in assessment that will allow students to have fewer distractors or choices for selected response or multiple choice questions is another digital option for blended learning. So there are so many things that are out there in blended learning that really allow us to meet and accommodate students' individual needs. And we certainly could talk very specifically. There are many more things about students with ADD, ADHD, but the most important is making sure that they are managing their time and helping them learn how to monitor that, which first means we monitor and remind, and then giving them strategies for monitoring themselves.
Great, thank you. Another question, when are there too many programs to incorporate into the daily schedule?
Well, you certainly have to think about what your learning goals are, and more is not always better. But we do need to meet the expectations for a grade level, whatever those standards might be. So when we think about programs, we want whatever we integrate from a digital perspective to fit into the schedule we have. So the schedule can include student homework, extended learning opportunities. So it doesn't all have to be during the classroom day, but can go beyond that. We have to keep in mind that ultimate goal and the amount of time we have for students to cover that content, and think about whether the program really furthers the goal and is critical to student attainment, is more effective than face-to-face time, for instance. So, just because a program exists doesn't mean that it's going to be an asset. But, I mentioned at first thinking about what are some of the problems that a school has or a classroom has. So if one of your problems happens to be, I don't have time to address this, and there is a program that will allow students to be very self-directed, that's a good solution. That's not an add-on, but that's an integrated option. So thinking about integrated options, not add-ons, and thinking very specifically about each program in terms of does it more effectively help your students attain the standards for that grade level.
Great, thank you. And we've had many questions asking, well, I should say many participants asking if this presentation will be available after the webinar. And so you should be receiving a thank you email from us with a link to the recorded webinar. With that, I'd like to thank you for attending Sadlier's webinar on the top 10 blended learning best practices. Again, should you like any additional information on blended learning or the digital program Sadlier offers to implement a blended learning model, please don't hesitate to email me. And again, I've put my email in the chat box. And we hope to see you on future Sadlier webinars. Thank you so much.